It was a dreary evening when Elizabeth Caldwell received the letter. The crisp, unopened envelope lay in her hands like a sinister weight. She had been living a quiet life for years in her modest flat on the outskirts of town. The letter had come from a distant relative she had never heard of, her great-uncle Thomas Caldwell, whose name she only vaguely remembered from childhood visits. The letter spoke of an inheritance, a mansion, and a mystery buried long ago in the town of Ravencroft. Her curiosity piqued. Elizabeth read the words carefully. "Dear Miss Caldwell, you are hereby invited to the reading of my last will and testament at Ravencroft House. The house has remained in the family for generations, though it has been abandoned for some time. In my final request, I ask that you come to the house and claim what is yours. The family secrets I have kept from you will be revealed in time. Do not delay. The estate waits for you. Yours faithfully, Thomas Caldwell." The mansion was located in the hills outside a forgotten town, an hour's drive from the nearest city. According to the letter, the house had been sealed for decades, but now Elizabeth was the sole inheritor. Though unsettled by the mysterious tone of the letter, Elizabeth had no reason to refuse the invitation. She had been burdened by the weight of financial struggles, and the promise of inheritance was something she could not ignore. Besides, there was something familiar about Ravencroft House, something she felt drawn to, like an invisible pull from the past. The drive to Ravencroft House was long and winding. Elizabeth's car climbed higher into the hills as the sunlight began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The fog grew denser the closer she came to the mansion, until it was so thick that she could barely see 10 feet ahead of her. Her heart beat faster, but she dismissed the sensation as nerves. Finally, she reached the gates. Ravencroft House stood on a small rise, looming in the distance, a decaying monument to a time long gone. It was a Gothic mansion with towering spires, crumbling stonework, and ivy crawling up the walls as though trying to reclaim it. The windows were all dark, the glass shattered in some places, as though the house had long since been abandoned. Elizabeth pulled up to the front door, which creaked open as if in welcome. She could feel her pulse quicken again. She stepped out of the car and into the damp, cold air. The fog surrounded her like a blanket, muffling every sound, turning everything into a ghostly blur. The house seemed so still, too still. She walked up the steps and turned the handle. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the house smelled of mildew, rot, and something older, something forgotten. "Hello?" Elizabeth called, her voice faint, swallowed by the vastness of the mansion. No answer, just silence. She stepped into the entryway, her footsteps echoing across the marble floors. The mansion was a time capsule. Antique furniture, dusty chandeliers, paintings covered in cobwebs. Yet something felt alive about it. The feeling of eyes upon her, watching from the dark corners of the room, made her skin crawl. A tall figure appeared at the top of the stairs. He was dressed in a dark suit, his features hidden beneath the shadow of the upper floor. "I am here for the reading of the will," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound confident. The figure did not move. He simply stood there watching her. Then the figure spoke in a deep, monotone voice. "You should not have come." The figure was gone before Elizabeth could react. The house was empty, save for her own breath, heavy in the silence. The chill in the air had deepened. She moved deeper into the mansion, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. In the dining room, a fire crackled in the hearth, the flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. But still, the house felt wrong. There was a strange, oppressive energy that weighed heavily on her. The scent of decay seemed to seep from the walls. Every corner was shrouded in darkness, and she could hear the faintest whisper of something or someone moving just beyond her sight. And then she saw him again, the man in the dark suit. He stood just behind her reflection in the ornate mirror above the fireplace. His face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes held nothing but empty voids. Elizabeth spun around, but the room was empty. "Who are you?" she whispered. A voice echoed in her mind, distant but unmistakable. "You're not supposed to be here. Leave." Elizabeth was on the verge of panic when the door to the study creaked open, as if inviting her inside. She hesitated, but curiosity pushed her forward. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth, and the room was lined with old, leather-bound books. At the center of the room was a large desk piled with papers. Atop the papers, a single object lay, an ornate box made of dark wood, covered in intricate carvings. As Elizabeth approached, she noticed that one of the carvings seemed to shift. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the box. The moment her skin brushed the wood, a cold gust of air rushed through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a voice spoke once again, closer this time. "Don't open it." The box was impossible to resist. Elizabeth, heart pounding, opened it. Inside was a collection of old letters, yellowed with age, and a small, weathered photograph. The photograph showed a group of people, her ancestors, it seemed. Among them, an older man with a sinister smile stood, his eyes dark pools. His expression unsettled her, but there was something familiar about his face. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the floor above. Elizabeth froze. She had not heard anyone enter the house, but now, someone, or something, was moving through the halls above her. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, as if dozens of voices were murmuring at once. She quickly gathered the letters, clutching them to her chest, and started toward the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, she was stopped by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing closer. She turned to find a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was the man from the mirror. His hollow eyes were locked on hers. "Leave. Now," he said, his voice commanding. But it was too late. As she reached the door, the ground trembled beneath her feet. The air grew thick, and the whispers swelled into a deafening chorus. The walls seemed to close in, the mansion shifting and groaning as if coming alive. A shadow moved across the room, coalescing into the figure of a tall, gaunt man whose features were obscured by the mist. His presence was suffocating, and Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. "You've awakened what should have stayed buried," the figure intoned. "Ravencroft House was never meant for you." The truth of Ravencroft House was darker than Elizabeth could have ever imagined. Her great-uncle Thomas had not been the kind, lonely relative she had hoped to meet. He had been a man obsessed with a dark, occult ritual, a ritual that involved the souls of his ancestors, sealed within the house to maintain an eternal cycle of suffering. As the night wore on, Elizabeth uncovered the horrifying truth. The house was cursed, and those who entered were never meant to leave. The figure that had watched her, her great-uncle, had died long ago, but his soul remained, trapped in the house, unable to rest. In the final confrontation, Elizabeth must make a choice: escape the house and break the curse, but at the cost of her family's memory and legacy, or embrace the darkness of Ravencroft and become part of the mansion's eternal suffering, adding her own soul to the house's twisted history. Elizabeth left Ravencroft House in silence, her car disappearing into the fog. The mansion loomed behind her, its dark silhouette barely visible in the morning light. The curse had been broken, for now. But Elizabeth knew the whispers would return, calling for someone else. And one day the house would call her name again.